time now for our next panel discussion, considering what is an evangelical and how use of the term differs in the US and here in the UK. Chairing this session, journalist, radio producer, media consultant and trainer, the wonderful Rosie Dawson. Rosie.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. We're going to be talking for the next 40 minutes or so about what an evangelical is, what US and UK evangelicals have in common, how do they differ, where are they heading? Please do engage with this discussion in the chat box, put your questions, and I'll try and get them to some of our panel during the conversation. So back in 1976, when a Georgian peanut farmer became president of the United States, much was made of the fact that he was an evangelical Christian. Jimmy Carter proclaimed he'd been born again. And being born again was something that happened to a lot of people on both sides of the Atlantic at Billy Graham rallies. If you said you're an evangelical, whether in America or in Britain, people would probably know what you meant. But the word evangelical has accrued many more meanings since then. And some of them are seen as so toxic that many Christians who might once have owned that label now find other ways to describe themselves. Follower of Jesus is the one that I see a lot on Twitter profiles. Let me introduce you to our panel. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. David Muir, who's the head of Whitelands College at the University of Roehampton, Professor Matthew Guest from the University of Durham, and Professor Andrea Hatcher from the University of the South in the USA. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to begin by asking you all for a very quick definition, 30 seconds, of what is an evangelical. And David, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I think when I was appointed as the director for the Evangelical Alliance for Public Theology, that was one of the questions I was asked, and I kind of hesitated, then said, I don't know. I feel I know a little more now. And first of all, an evangelical is someone who really believes in the authenticity of the gospel. They believe in the reality of conversion, and they think that the mission of God has got something to do with saving other people. Apart from that, I don't want it to be a term that's used as a form of name calling, but I see evangelicals as being part of the normal mainstream Christianity that has politicized itself in some places, but the actual term itself needs to be reclaimed.
Matthew, what's your definition of the evangelical?
Well, I think a lot of what I'd say mirrors what David has already said, but in a more sociological register, I guess, because that's what I do. And I'm interested in how we can identify religious groups in distinction from one another. So I'd say that there are three key features of the evangelical movement, and this has been the case since really its inception in the post-Reformation period. The first is an elevation of biblical authority above all else. The second is a focus on conversionism, in other words, the importance of being born again in order to be recognized as a Christian. And thirdly, a commitment to evangelism, whether that's formulated as converting other people or reaching out to the community in putting the gospel message into action.
So Andrea, take us through, how did evangelical become something rather different in the States, more of a political designation?
Absolutely. In the US, evangelical is less a religious term and more of a political label. That assertion is grounded in data showing that there is a significant decline in the frequency of church attendance among self-identified evangelicals from, say, 2008 to 2020. And in fact, when controlling for other factors, a self-identified evangelical who never goes to church is 10% more likely to be a Republican today than in 2008. Interestingly enough, an evangelical who does attend church weekly is 5% less likely to identify as Republican now than in 2008. So what we have seen in and after the Trump era is a decided break between the religious aspect and the political aspect of the label.
In a real nutshell, explain how from Jimmy Carter through to the present day, the whole understanding of what an evangelical is in the States seems to have become changed into this sort of political category.
Absolutely. That was a concerted effort at political mobilization by religious leaders and political leaders, particularly partisan leaders in the Republican Party, to mobilize a very intense group for political purposes. And so how that happened is the story of the formation of the Christian right. And that has had tremendous effects on American politics, and even one could say global politics.
I'm interested in whether the pollsters sort of reflect or create an identity, because, you know, white evangelical is one of the categories when they're surveying voting intentions and so on. Interesting, it's white evangelicals. So are pollsters sort of guilty of sort of bolstering that identity, do you think?
I think there might be something to that, but there is a self-reinforcing effect. Whereby white evangelicals buy into this label and use it as a cultural shortcut then going forward. And you're absolutely right. Evangelical use in the US today typically means cultural white conservatives. That has a very different political connotation than when one includes Black evangelicals.
And when the pollsters devise their categories, where do they put Black evangelicals? Or do they not have a category for them?
No. So particularly scholars, and you know, it depends on the quality of the poll, how they break up religion and race. But scholars, when they are considering the difference, study white evangelical Protestants and Black Protestants as two distinct categories because their political attitudes and behaviors are so different. Black evangelicals are quite conservative on social issues, more liberal on economic issues, but unlike white evangelicals, they don't vote on the cultural issues. They tend to vote their economic interest.
I wonder, I mean, David, is it that Black Christians, perhaps on both sides of the Atlantic, are more likely to call themselves, as Dulcie was saying earlier, Black Pentecostals, or they choose a different name rather than evangelical to describe themselves, even though in terms of their centering on the Bible and on worship, they might have an awful lot in common with white evangelicals?
Well, I think, I mean, when I speak to my colleagues across the pond, you know, quite a number of them are Pentecostal leaders, and they're not unhappy with the label of evangelical, but what they are unhappy with is the politics of evangelicals. And of course, I think that's because, as you know, Andrea rightly said, because that's so now identified with the politics of the right, that, you know, Pentecostals who will identify themselves as evangelicals will want to shy away from that label. And so, for example, when I think about, you know, a recent book by Tad DeLay entitled Against, you know, what does the white evangelicals want? One of those things that they actually want is to separate themselves theologically from some of the Black evangelicals. So what we're really what we are seeing, I think, is the polarization of evangelicals and evangelicalism along racial lines, especially over the last 20 years.
But you mentioned sort of theological differences between them. Can you just summarize what those are?
Well, I think, I mean, take someone like, you know, T.G. Jakes. You know, T.G. Jakes would classify himself as a Black evangelical, a Pentecostal, whose theology isn't radically different from, say, someone like Robinson in America. But when it comes to issue of race and social justice, I think their kind of historical roots actually diverse. And so if one thinks about, say, someone like an organization like the Church of God in Christ, which is a Black Pentecostal rooted church, would very much identify themselves with the evangelical politics. But of course, there are issues where, you know, they radically disagree. And so I think what is happening is that because evangelicals have got this kind of label that you can't separate out white evangelicals from, dare I use the word, from a kind of a racist discourse that often Black Pentecostals and Black evangelicals try to avoid the label because of its negative associations.
Matthew, pollsters in the UK don't use evangelical as a designation when they're looking at people's religious affiliation, do they? Would it be crazy to suggest that they did?
Well, I guess any pollster is going to be focused on which categories make most sense within a given context. And if they see a particular category as capturing a very tiny proportion of the national population, then they're going to be less interested in using it. I think when they deal with religion, and very few pollsters bother to do so because we're so heavily secularized on this side of the pond, then they're more likely to see things in terms of Christian and non-Christian. And they're more likely to get numbers that make those measures significant. So we have to look at more specific, specialized kind of studies to get any information about evangelicals as such.
And do we have any information about the way evangelicals in this country might vote? For instance, in the way that in the States, we all know the statistic, about 80% of white evangelicals are Republicans.
Well, we know some. There is a bit of data on this that can give us an indication both of political persuasions and on voting patterns. But there's been so much political upheaval in the UK over the last 2 or 3 years that it's difficult to know whether those findings still pertain. But the picture certainly a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, was that British evangelicals would tend to be fairly conservative on issues of personal morality, but fairly left-leaning on issues of politics. But also because of the historical linkages between the Church of England and the Conservative Party, and the Labour Party and the Catholic Church, and the liberals and the nonconformists, then the Christian vote has always been split. So there hasn't been a natural party home for evangelicals, or Christians indeed, within the British political system.
There is now the rise of Christian nationalism in the States. How much is that identified with white evangelicals? Andrew or David, would one of you like to? David, can you speak to that?
Well, I mean, I would only say that over the last 10 years at least, I think white evangelicals to some extent have shown their true colors. If one thinks about what happened in, say, LA over the last, from the 40s to the 60s, you saw white evangelical flight from those areas. And I think, that really, I think that actually placed evangelicals in a very, very narrow camp when it came to issues around race and social justice. And there is a very interesting book out now by Robert Jones entitled "The End of White Christian America." And I think what Jones is implying is that the end of white Christian America really means the end of white evangelicals as they are currently constituted. And I think, that tells you something about it, because however one wants to actually look at it, you can't separate out the rise of Donald Trump from the rise and the continual rise of white evangelicals in America. And I think those divided lines are becoming so kind of stark now that maybe white evangelicals have got to do a bit of soul searching, I think, to ask themselves not only why they changed their mind, but what does evangelicalism mean right now? And we know back in the 18th century, I think it was Lord Shaftesbury, he said, evangelicals, no one knows what an evangelical is. I think we are beginning to understand that if you are an evangelical, yes, you believe in the Bible, yes, you believe in some kind of social action, but you must also think socially about the impact of racial justice. And white evangelicals in America have done that historically very, very badly.
Andrea, do you want to say something here? I mean, we know that for all that they are a very powerful political force, they are demographically on the wane. What's that going to mean?
I think I would just add to what David said, that race is at the heart of this notion of Christian nationalism, this idea that Christians own the nation and that any attempt at pluralism requires that they take our country back, is the narrative that we hear a lot. take our country back from whom, the secularists, the liberals, immigrants, Muslims, homosexuals, any other group that challenges their supremacy. So white evangelicalism, Christian nationalism, it is this belief system based on an in-group, out-group division, whereby anyone who is not white, conservative Christian is out. And you were speaking about demographic changes. What is interesting is that there tends to be this shortcut assumption that as whites lose demographic supremacy, that they will also lose political power. I don't know that that's the case, because what we're seeing is that Hispanics, particularly Hispanic evangelicals, that they are quite conservative, both economically and culturally. And so in the most recent presidential election, for example, they were central to the state of Florida, being a Republican state, those electoral votes going to Donald Trump. And the same sort of pattern in Florida, in Texas, and Arizona, whereby Hispanics gave their support to the Republican Party. So I think that it's a bit of a faulty shortcut to assume that demographic changes, that is the weakening of white demography in the U.S., is going to have the political effects that we think.
Just thinking about that rhetoric of take our country back. I mean, we do hear that in this country as well. But Matthew, I mean, if it is at all identified with any religious grouping, it's not with the evangelicals, is it? I mean,
no, that in a way that really does capture a major difference between the UK and the US. In that in the US, the ethno-nationalism that's associated with Donald Trump has been linked religiously to the evangelical faction. Whereas in the UK, if there is a group which is associated with a politics structured around a quest to reclaim the country or get back something that's been lost, and we know all about that kind of rhetoric from the Brexit debates, then it seems to be most popular amongst members of the Church of England, and not necessarily evangelical members. So,
and not necessarily people who actually go to the Church of England, but more people
not necessarily people who go either. No. And this is interesting as well, because Andrea is right about the American data as well, that there are apparent patterns that suggest that those who are especially keen on elevating Christian nationalism as a cause are also not necessarily very religious. And so it becomes a cultural political cause, in the same way I would suggest that Brexit becomes a cultural religious cause within the UK, but backed up by a different constituency.
Can we just move on a bit to how evangelicals in the US and UK might read their Bibles differently? Or it might not be that they have a different approach to the Bible, but they might bring different concerns to the Bible. I mean, there was some, obviously we know the sort of extraordinary readings that came out in the Trump era, that, President Trump was King Cyrus, or, Jeff Sessions saying that using Romans 13 to justify separating migrant children from their parents. But in what are the issues where the evangelicals are looking to their Bibles and saying, this is what the Bible says about this, and this is why we are taking this action in this way?
I mean, that's a very, very tough question. I think biblicism, whether it's in the US or it's in the UK, is always going to mean different things. So, for example, when I think about, the formations of radical evangelicalism, and I think of someone like Jonathan Edwards, 18th century, didn't really say too much about slavery, didn't really say too much about social justice. George Whitefield, great as he was, preached a lot about conversion, but then someone like Charles Finney, Presbyterian, actually started the first mass abolition movement. So I think people can read the Bibles differently. People can read the same text and come to different conclusion. Maybe there's something about biblical literacy, which I think evangelicals have got to get better at. And dare I say, and Andrea may have the kind of research at her fingertips, I think white evangelicals have got to get a bit more biblically literate, and I think, unless that happens, how people interpret the Bible and what they think about the Bible is going to radically change.
I would just respond and say that white evangelicals, white Protestants, white evangelicals specifically in the States have a long history of reading the Bible and using scripture to justify whatever position, political position, social position they want to hold, from slavery on down to the current designation of President Trump as King Cyrus, or even as he himself described as the chosen one.
Mm.
And I think that it fits too, Rosie, with this trend that we've discussed in the US, evangelical less a religious designation and more of a political heuristic, a political cue. And so I think that there has been this break between the religious understanding of evangelical and political. And if they're not going to church, if the label has no religious meaning to them, they're probably not reading their Bible with any sense of theological or literate sort of interpretation, as David was.
I just wonder, and whoever wants to respond to this, please do. I mean, I've always associated in a way some evangelical readings of the Bible in the States being particularly concerned with millennialism, with end times theology, with the position of the state of Israel, in a way that I don't hear that to the same extent in the UK. So what would I hear here instead?
I think you'd hear a lot more about personal morality, so issues to do with sexuality and gender and leadership. And you'd probably find a much stronger link between evangelical interpretations of the Bible and causes that are structured around social justice or poverty, inclusion. I mean, the Black Pentecostal churches do incredible work with empowering communities in education and things like that. There's lots of evangelical organizations in the UK that are primarily focused on issues to do with humanitarian relief. So that link is much stronger, I think, in the UK. The causes that have been so dramatically influential in the US, particularly abortion, creationism, and also the link with apocalyptic Christianity, have always been very marginal within the UK movement for complicated historical reasons.
There is, I think, I was listening to Dulcie on the other conversation talking about the New Testament Church of God and some of the churches that were formed. And I'm thinking of, within the New Testament Church of God, which, as Dulcie rightly says, it's, a Black Pentecostal church in the UK, but it's a white dominated church globally. We've got some fringe groups who, for the want of a better word, you may want to call these people Christian Zionists, who are kind of a teaching and preaching some kind of pristine Judaism, which is not only dangerous, it's it's biblically unsound. And many of our pastors within the Pentecostal churches in the UK are avid supporters of Israel. And I think that's one of those characteristics of, I suppose, British evangelicalism that one has got to at least interrogate. And so I remember back in 2008, Joel Edwards, who was then, you probably remember, Rosie, he was Director General of the Evangelical Alliance, wrote a book entitled The Agenda for Change. And he was really calling evangelicals to think much more about social transformation that is actually biblically informed. And I think if there is a difference, I'm sure that there are. I think evangelicals over here, be they white or black, are a bit more kind of nuanced with their interpretation of the Bible, and they do actually prioritize certain issues around social justice.
I mean, if we were to do a word association on the word evangelical, I imagine one that would come up pretty quickly would be happy clappy, when we associate it with a particular style of worship. Andrew, are there any differences in that style of worship that you notice between the UK and the US?
Well, it's funny that you should mention that, Rosie, because I did do a word association on a survey that I did of British evangelicals in my study a few years ago, and happy clappy was a prominent description. And so I think that is one trait that evangelicals in the US and evangelicals in the UK share. And that's why I was comfortable making the comparisons that I did. They are very much related in terms of religious belief and practice, and they share some of the same conferences, leaders, songs. So there's a lot of diffusion across the pond in that way. Where they differ is in the political outflow of that theology. So for American evangelicals, their theological conservatism naturally leads them to some understanding of political conservatism. There isn't that natural connection for British evangelicals, but they do share in this a strong similarity in religious practice, owing to I would say the influence, bi-directional influence between the UK and US evangelical church.
I'm just wondering how much the influence does go both ways, because Matthew, I think you would say that a great deal of British evangelicalism is sort of taking models of organising from the States and just sort of transposing it here.
Yeah, there are lots of examples of that, and I think many evangelicals in the UK look to the US for a model of success as they see it. They see larger churches, they see richer churches, they see churches that are more vibrant, and they see higher levels of personal commitment. And it's only natural that one would try and find out, well, what's the secret of their success? And so, and it's also understandable, therefore, that there'll be American initiatives that would seek to disseminate what they do via those cross Atlantic channels. And I think that the one exception going the other direction, one notable exception, there are a few, but the most significant would be the Alpha Course, which is now, of course, a global brand within the evangelical world and has managed to export something that was developed within a very particular London-based context and send it abroad as a form of programmatic evangelism in a variety of contexts globally. But the US examples that have done similar things are much more abundant. I mean, there's many more that you could cite, from the Willow Creek organization through to various mission groups. And looking away from the States as well, the networks within Pentecostalism that stretch into West Africa, which are also significant. So I think in looking and trying to understand where evangelicalism is going, particularly in the UK context, we have to look at a global picture, not because we are not constrained by the UK, but because the UK movement looks globally for its inspiration and for its resources.
Just give us an example of something like, just unpack something like the way the Global Leadership Summit works and the influence that has on churches here. And then, David, I'll come to you on the extent to which the future of evangelicalism in Britain is determined not just by the US, but by the whole global South and so on. So, Matthew.
Okay, well, the Global Leadership Summit is an initiative that was set up by Willow Creek, which is a huge megachurch based in the outer Chicago area, which really became well known for its church growth strategies, which it exported elsewhere and encouraged other evangelical churches to follow. And it set up this conference that was based on the idea that if they wanted to develop excellence of leadership, then churches should look for excellence in examples of other professions, not just the church, but in business and in education, in the charitable sector, and so forth. And so they encouraged notable national speakers to come and talk to church leaders, and then church leaders would be invited to the conference that took place in Chicago. And that ran for a few years and was very, very popular. But eventually, there was a global thirst for something along the same lines. And so the Global Leadership Summit was exported as a franchised package that was then sent to whichever churches were interested in holding their own summit, wherever they were in the world, so that they could send off for the material from Willow Creek, and they would get all the books for the bookstall, they would get the workbooks for the small groups, they would get the DVDs of the speakers. And each year they would hold their own Global Leadership Summit, but it would be in a church in St Albans or in whatever, any location in Britain that was interested. So it's an example of the way in which a kind of global circulation of evangelical resources gets taken up and influences things that are happening at the ground level across the world, and the US really leads in taking that forward.
So that's very much a sort of global business export in a way. I saw David smiling in recognition about quite a lot of that. But David, what's the export as far as West Africa is concerned in terms of the influence on evangelicals? I mean, maybe in the US, but certainly in the UK.
I was smiling because I think Matthew is absolutely spot on. When I was at the Evangelical Alliance, we bought into that hook, line, and sinker. But of course, there were leaders who were asking themselves, is this not another form of spiritual imperialism from the States? But anyway, that's something else. Around about 208, I think Ian Bradley wrote a book entitled Believing in Britain. And Bradley's thesis, or some of it, was that maybe God is actually using African and Caribbean churches to re-evangelize the UK. I always thought that was sociologically flawed, but that's for another conversation. But what I do think is interesting is this: if you look at a global, if you look at a transnational church like the Redeemed Christian Church of God, RCCG, which is one of the largest Pentecostal churches in Europe. You see, for example, COVID notwithstanding, prior to COVID, at least 2 times a year, you had a prayer meeting, and that's what it is, a prayer meeting at the Excel Center with over 40,000 people coming to pray for the whole night. Now, you have archbishops going to those meetings, you have prime ministers, politicians. Of course, David Cameron went there last time, but he still lost. The great man, Pastor Enoch Adeboye, prayed for him. The point I'm making is this, is that some of the, let's call these white churches, are asking themselves, well, if African and Caribbean churches, especially the West African churches, are growing, what is it that they're doing that we can actually learn from? And I think that kind of missionary zeal, that evangelism, that dynamic preaching could be something that I think the future of evangelicalism in the UK could look like. But I also think that, one needs to be very, very careful, because after all, the kind of Black population is under 4%, right? And even if 50% of Black folks go to church, it's still relatively small. But in places like London and large inner cities, we are seeing what the future of Christian Britain could look like. And what is that? Well, that's actually evangelical, that is charismatic, that is young. And of course, most of the leaders in some of the RCCD churches are getting much more biblically and theologically educated, because they really believe, unlike my parents and Dulcie's parents who came in the 50s, that they're here to actually stay, and God has actually called them to re-evangelize the UK. So I think there's a lot in that.
So if evangelicals in this country might be asking themselves about that in relation to West Africa, Andrew, in the States, white evangelicals asking about what they can learn from Hispanic evangelicals, or what are where are they looking for their new energy from, given that they are on the wane?
I would say that in the US, that the direction of evangelicalism post-Trump will be more political and more extremist, as the moderates and those with the spiritual understanding or interpretation of evangelicalism have left, as the movement has largely embraced Donald Trump. So as I look ahead and see evangelicalism in the US, I don't know that they are certainly looking to the global South for any cues. I think that the residue that's left is this Christian nationalist, white ethno-nationalist core of a political group, fundamentally, more than any sort of religious group.
We've just got a few minutes left. I've got a question in the chat box. probably for you, David, in the first instance, but what would your call to action be to evangelical communities in resisting the sort of divisions that that are being sort of presented through a sort of lens of culture war? And how can evangelicals resist being drawn into those wars?
It's going to be another, it's one of those perennial conversations, I think. And I think what has got to be at the forefront are issues around citizenship, the common good, and that strange word that we still like to use, being a prophetic Christian that fully understands the metaphor of salt and light where you are. Whether it's about how we treat different people from different culture, whether it's about the kind of racial discourse. I think we've got to think beyond our own little tribes, our theological tribes, and we've got to start to think about the common good. And I think the Christian resources are ample to be able to tackle a lot of those issues. I just feel that unless and until white evangelicals in particular are able to actually give up some of their power, give up some of the kind of prestige that they've accrued historically, and start to do what I think Rowan Williams called many years ago receptive ecumenism, where you really take on board that there are things that you can learn from other Christians. I think we're going to be in a pretty awful place. But I'm optimistic. I'm really optimistic when I see young people. When I think about what happened after the death of George Floyd, we saw an generational and an international insurrection of decency, where people are saying, certain things are just downright wrong. And if Christians aren't going to be at the forefront of saying that, then I think we should give up all these ridiculous labels, whether you call yourself an evangelical or anything else, and ask yourself, well, what can I do as a citizen that benefits everyone else?
We've got very little time left, so I'm going to go for one question to each of you. Matthew, the flavour of Christianity, evangelical Christianity in this country in 20 years' time. Tell me about it.
Wow. I think we'll see a much smaller population of Christians, but as it shrinks, I'd imagine that it could actually become more vibrant and, potentially more politically engaged. But I think that it might take a more intensified experience of crisis for that to be inspired. But it's a very difficult question to answer.
And Andrea, at this sort of post-Trump moment, with evangelicals perhaps in something of crisis, really, about which direction to go, which direction will they head in?
Yes, Rosie. So, I think that we are really seeing a moment of division, in a moment of choosing, one might say, among American evangelicals, whether to pursue this hyper politicization that was so evident in the Trump era. And I think that has left a core of political evangelicals who are as extremist as ever in their views of Christian nationalism, ethno-nationalism. I think that has had the opposite effect in driving many moderates away, and those who are utterly repelled by that move. Just today in our New York Times, there was a story about John Piper's son, Abraham, who has become something of a TikTok sensation in rejecting the fundamentalist evangelicalism of his youth. And so there is this movement of ex-evangelicals that have just heightened as a result of the hyper politicization that we've seen in the Trump era. I think that at this moment, we're at this moment of choosing of division, where evangelicals will decide which path they are going to take.
And David, very briefly, I mean, as religion journalists, we like to think that it really matters how we report on evangelicals and how we describe them. Why does it matter?
I think it actually matters because community matters. And therefore, I think we all have got to reflect, especially in America, white evangelicals have got to reflect on the evangelical road to Donald Trump. You know, they must do that. And then they've got to repent, I think. And evangelicals are sometimes bad at that, you know, and then we may start to see a renewal of some kind around issues to do with social justice and community cohesion. So evangelicals matter because we're talking about the gospel, we're talking about truth, we're talking about life and death. And if we haven't got the good news, after all, isn't that what it's about? Unless we can actually bring the good news to our world, we might as well pack our bags, I think.
Thank you very much, Andrea, Matthew and David. Again, as with all the panels, we could have gone on forever. I hope we'll speak again on all this before too long. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.